And good morning. This morning we're coming to the 10th of our reflections as we are going to be looking at passages drawn out of the book of Psalms. This morning we're going to come to a passage in Psalm 71. This is one of the Psalms that is anonymous. We don't know who wrote it, but it's an interesting message and one that I think is very timely, both for me and for the church, and I hope for you as well. Here's what God wants to say to us today. For you have been my hope, sovereign Lord, my confidence since my youth. From birth I have relied on you, and you brought me forth from my mother's womb, and I will ever praise you. Americans know a great deal about growing things, growing crops, growing stores, growing merchandise, growing churches. In fact, if you look, there's no lack of books on how to grow churches. In fact, no lack of books looking at, well, that's a growing church. Let's be like that church. But if you look for books that will write about growing churches that will last, after all, the church is intended to stand not just over 1 year or 5 years or 10, but generations. We live in a country surrounded by empty stores, abandoned malls, all of the trappings of the realization that we know a lot about growing things that grow quickly, but just as quickly fade and die. When we were in Missouri, we planted some trees in our backyard, a couple of maple trees and then an oak tree in between the two. And by the time we left, those maple trees were so impressive. They towered enough that they were actually providing shade for the upper floor deck in the house. The oak tree, rather pitifully, was less than half their size, which explains why oak is a much stronger wood than maple. Back a number of years ago, when I was preaching at the oldest continually meeting Christian church of the Stone Campbell movement that's still in existence in the United States, it's in the little town of Cynthiana, outside the town in Harrison County, Kentucky. And it's called the Indian Creek Christian Church. It was started before Kentucky was even a state. And on the way into the old sanctuary, you'd walk past the gravestones of people who'd been born before the United States was a nation. What an opportunity to say, we're surrounded by those who have experienced the praise and the worship and the faithfulness of God, generation to generation. In fact, I was there when the planes went into the Twin Towers. And on that Tuesday evening, we made lots of phone calls, and the church was packed, especially with children, and they were all terrified, as we all were. And that's when one of the elders, who was already in his early 80s, Clarence Horn, at my invitation, came up front and told that group of rapt and very frightened children what it was like to sit in that very pew when they gathered after the news of Pearl Harbor had come. What it was like to sit there when they were afraid and didn't know what the future was going to hold and saw the possibility of war looming. And they found God faithful. Other people stood up and talked about where God had been in their life when some scary and terrible tragedy happened. And they found God faithful. And there in that room, they were surrounded by old people, young adults, little children, all of us frightened. But it was to the elderly that we turned our ears and heard them say, God, since my youth, you have been faithful, and I will praise you. That's how to grow a church that's much more like an oak than just a high shoot of bamboo that'll be here for a season and then gone the next. God bless.